Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and I have today as my guest Peter Wiesner. He is the author of the Holocaust memoir, Bipolar Refugee, A Saga of Survival and Resilience. It's about his mother, who actually got out of Berlin in 1939 in the Kinder Transport. But we're going to talk about her a little bit, but we're also going to talk about the girls' school, a Jewish girls' school in Berlin that Peter wants to share information about. So, first of all, your mother was born in 1922, and she wasn't born in Berlin, right?
No, she wasn't. In Friedland, Mecklenburg, which is north of Berlin.
Okay. So, was she an only child?
She was there until about 1928 or 29. They moved to Strasbourg, which is also in Mecklenburg, because her father had lost his business. And she went to school in Strasbourg for the first grade. And then the family went to Berlin, where her maternal relatives, who came from generally middle class background, were able to enable them to get a fresh start. Uh, Her father's family was, except for him, they were either in America or they had perished in the Holocaust. But many of them had already emigrated to America.
Okay, so now the Jewish school that you wanted to talk about, it's a high school only, is that correct?
Not really. It's more like a middle school. Now, this here, I can give you a picture of what happened.
Yes.
She was in a, she was in Berlin. First, her family sent her to a progressive school, Pestalozzi, which is sort of very enlightened teaching methods because she had trouble adjusting to big city life. But she did fine there, and then she went to public school there and did very well. And she was actually admitted to gymnasium, which is really the college prep higher education or academic high school basically. And 3 months there, it was 1933. Jewish kids were kicked out.
That's
And
what I wanted to.
she actually describes what happened, that the teacher came up to her and said, I'm afraid you're going to have to leave because of your father's Polish heritage, because her last name was Koroshinsky, and of course, being Jewish. So she was suddenly yanked out of there, and she was devastated by it because she loved it, and she was pretty well treated in schools up to that point. So her father, I think, because of his connection with uh, the liberal as a cantor, and also connections with the Jewish community, or it's called the Jüdische Gemeinde. That's the phrase that's used, and
Right.
the
Mhm.
translation is Jewish community. And they managed to get her enrolled in the Jewish Girls' School in Berlin, which was, maybe a mile or so from where they lived. And at first, she wasn't too keen, but she was kind of a streperous girl, and very athletic and just, want to have fun and all that. But her parents let her ride the bike there, which kind of delighted her because she could zigzag through Berlin traffic and get to the school. I mean, that's the kind of kid she was. She was quite exuberant, and the school was turned out to be a haven because by that time the anti-Semitism had stepped up. I mean, she describes in the book, and a lot of the book is in her own words, uh, of what happened, that you couldn't go to the beach. Those stories are very familiar, and more life surrounded. Her life consisted of going to family events or spending times with her friends or being at the school, which had a very, it had a religious instruction, but also it was pretty much patterned after the German Enlightenment in terms of its curriculum. So, and at first she had trouble adjusting, but then the teachers took interest in her, and her grades went way up, and she excelled in everything. And she was in the choir, which was taught by Rudy Zabor, who was a young man at the time, but he turned out to be a Wagner expert in Britain. So that's one of the connections she made at this school with that teacher. She had a lifelong correspondence with him, and I have all the correspondence from him, obviously. And there was this split between, being Jewish and being in love with German culture. And that also permeated that correspondence that she had with her teacher.
Now wait, but he was Jewish, right?
Oh yeah, he was Jewish.
Because at this point
I
now,
just lost
non-Jewish,
something.
yeah, non-Jewish teachers couldn't teach at a Jewish school, I assume.
That's right. The reason why the school was so good is because they had all this talent to draw from,
Um,
people who were kicked out of the local schools. Now, mind you, in Berlin had about 160,000 population. One fourth of them, or less than one fourth, sent their kids to religious schools. The rest went to public school. So you can imagine what a crisis it was to have a large
Wait a
number of
second.
kids
You
suddenly
mean
not having schools.
160,000, excuse me,
Jews,
100 Jews.
yes.
Yes, you said Berlin had a population of
No, 106.
160,000.
Didn't I say Jews? I'm
No,
sorry.
and I'm in my
There's something
mind is
missing in here.
okay. So
Little
I'm
blip
just saying,
here.
okay, less than one fourth.
160,000 Jews. And I looked that up just when I preparing for this because I needed to have some data. And so what happened is when the school, the Jewish Girls' School was established around 1922 or so. No, it was actually 1930. Yeah, it was established when she was born in 1922, and it moved into this building on Auguststraße, which is in the middle of Berlin, Die Mitte, it's called, and it's like a few blocks from the Neue Synagogue, which is kind of a landmark. So you
Yes,
can easily
I
find
I've
the
been there.
school
Yes.
and do that. Yeah, and so. They moved into that building in 1930, which had been designed by this architect, Alexander Beer. And I'm going to be looking at my notes so I don't screw up
That's
any
okay. That's
facts
okay.
here.
So he's talking about they
Um,
moved into the school building.
yeah, and
It
the
was
thing
built for them, right? It was built for the school.
yeah, it was so well, what happened is let me see that. Yeah, Alexander Beer was a well-known architect, and he did a number, and he was associated with a movement called Die Neue Sachlichkeit, or the New Objectivity.
Hmm.
So he's important in architectural
Wait, and
history.
now was he Jewish?
Oh yeah, yeah, he was Jewish. Yes, I'm sorry, he should assume that. And he did a Jewish orphanage and memorials. He was definitely Jewish and employed, by the Jewish community to do a number of projects. So that was one feature that I think figures in the story about my mother and her experience at the school because the architecture was kind of splendid. And and that's why that school was also such a refuge because it was really a beautiful place with mosaics. They had a rooftop where her where they had their choir rehearsals. They had a small gymnasium. It was just like I wouldn't say it was a country club or anything, but it was a nice place to go to from 1933 to 1937. And that's the period during which she studied. And then she graduated, and it was sort of all over for her in Berlin.
Wait,
There
wait.
was no place to
I
go.
interrupt you about one thing. So
Okay.
what did the Jewish parents whose kids were not currently in Jewish schools, the other three-fourths of the 160,000, where'd their kids go?
Well, it's a good question. There were a lot of schools were set up in Berlin. Some of them were private schools. Uh, I don't know to what extent people just suddenly had no education. I can't believe that in the Jewish community that would happen. They would figure out one way or another for kids to have an education.
Yeah.
And besides, there were so many still Jewish people between that period, and they were being let go in other professions. So in one way or another, they got an education while they were there. Uh, and I'm sure it varied in quality, but I bet there are a lot of stories about pretty high quality education during that period.
Okay, so now we have your mother. She graduates in 1937, and then what?
Right. Well,
Oh, wait.
she's
I
at
think we
home.
need to explain this because of the age that she goes in the transplant. She's not graduating from high school,
No, no, she.
where they take, what is it called? The aperture. They still took that, they took it then, right? She
Well, the
doesn't,
Abitur is at the end of the gymnasium, which is she never went to gymnasium except for 3 months.
right.
And the Jewish girls' school took her to roughly the eighth or ninth grade. Okay, it's like junior high school. Pretty solid education, languages, the whole 9 yards, math, everything. Uh,
Did they have Hebrew? Did they study Hebrew?
yeah, she did. In fact, she was in a play about Rabbi Akiva, and I have the photograph of that. I could have brought it and shown it to you, but I tested. It didn't look good doing on
Yeah,
Zoom, so
okay.
I decided not to do that. But
So I
you
just
know,
wanted to make a plain to
yeah,
people listening, though, that while she graduated in 37, it's not the equivalent of a high school graduation
no,
because
it
she
is.
was not allowed.
That's right. So she wanted to go continue her schooling. I mean, that's what was she under normal circumstances she would have gone to a gymnasium. That was closed to her. Uh, Absolutely, and there were no real opportunities to do that uh, the Jewish route. They weren't set up for that, or not that I know of. So 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 there was this period of time from 37 to 39 where she stayed home. She helped at home. Her father wasn't very well, and she also did domestic work. She also worked for a milliner, and she did housekeeping tasks for other people. And more Jews were losing their jobs, including members of a middle class family. So suddenly, the family network that had been there to provide all the support, the money just wasn't there anymore. It just went. And by Kristallnacht, or whatever you want to call it,
Yes,
uh,
I do like to say that the Germans do not call it the Night of Broken
no,
Glass. They call it, Peter should say it to me, Reichsprogramm Nacht. I can't say it very well, but uh,
Reichspogromnacht.
and it was no, then it started the night of November 9th, 1938, and it was not spontaneous. I just told Peter this story that when I was, my husband and I were stationed in Munich, and I worked at the Army Air Force Motion Picture Service under the status of occupation agreement. There had to be various Germans working with us, and Miss Winkler was in night school on November 9th, 1938, and they were sent in Munich, and they were sent home early for the spontaneous action.
Yeah,
So,
spontaneous. Yeah, it
yeah.
was pretty orchestrated.
Mhm.
And my mother actually went with her father to Neubrandenburg to just accompany him when he wasn't well. And she tells the story that he was finally involved in the ceremony. She was always put off by the fact that girls didn't have much of a role in the synagogue. So, but he sort of made an exception because they knew the end was near, and this was before Kristallnacht. And surely enough, the synagogue where my grandfather was a cantor, that was burned down, and there are no records left. I can't even prove that he ever was a cantor except by by photos of him and uh, and my mother's recollection. And
Now
also
where was
our
this
family
synagogue?
lore. There's no written record that I've been able to get, and I made a tremendous effort to do so in Berlin when I was there doing research at the Neue Synagogue. At the Stiftung, they have a
They have,
research,
right.
and they
But you're
said there was so much was lost, so many records were lost.
okay, wait a second. Now I have
Yeah.
to inject to clarify. First of all, but your grandfather was not a cantor at the Neue Synagogue.
No,
Okay,
he was
okay,
associated with that branch of Judaism.
okay, okay. Number two, I told this to Peter already, that on the night of November 9th, 1970, I was in Munich reading a book about Jews, and the army had given us an apartment. and I learned about Kristallnacht for the first time, and I realized it was the anniversary, which was so spooky. But I want to say one thing about the Neue Synagogue, and I wish I could remember this man's name. It didn't burn totally to the ground because after it started burning, a fire chief came and said, put out the flames, which happened very, very, very rarely in the rest of Germany, Sudetenland, and Austria. But that's why the Neue Synagogue was actually better preserved until the bombing of the Americans to
That's what I
liberate.
understand.
Yeah. Okay. But the reason the archives are there today is because that's where the archives are. There's a little museum there. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, was either a fireman or policeman who did, or
Yeah,
somebody high
it was an
up,
official. You're right. I
and
can't
for
remember whether it's a
historic
police. It might
reasons,
have been a police chief. Yes, you instead of a fire chief. And I should clarify that. But someone, an official
capacity, yes.
who normally would have been standing by and saying nothing, actually, for whatever reason, decided to save the synagogue. And I don't think it's just because the walls, I don't even remember whether the walls were next to others, which is reasons why in other places, sometimes they didn't burn the complete buildings. But for whatever reason, he wanted this fire put out.
And I'm amazed that the cemetery wasn't destroyed and completely desecrated. You know, the Weissensee Cemetery, where my grandfather is buried, it's still pretty much intact, which is
Oh,
amazing.
okay, so let's talk
Yeah.
about where your grandfather died at what point.
He died in when my mother was already in England, and she was already a nurse then. I think she was still training at the point, and 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 she there was a notification that her father had died. She didn't know the circumstances until much later. He'd actually died from a beating, and he was beaten by the Gestapo and died the next day. He had a heart condition. Um,
And he died in the Jewish hospital, as you told me.
yeah,
But wait,
that's
let's
right.
rewind. So your mother was 16 at the time of Kristallnacht. And
Yeah.
then for uh, some Jewish groups and non-Jewish groups sprang into action to get Jews out, although they only had till September 39, so they didn't even have a year. How did your mother get on the list? How do you know how that worked?
Uh, no, I don't know exactly how she got on the list. They were her parents were very surprised that she was accepted. Um, uh, that information isn't, and it's been in my mind to try to find out because the selection process seemed to me kind of haphazard. I mean, there were instances where people were interviewed to make sure the children were fit to travel on their own. But as far as the overall program, you know, my understanding is it was put together very, very quickly, haphazardly, a lot of volunteers, spotty record keeping, and they're still doing research, as to how exactly this thing happened. Now there were all kinds of kinder transports
Right.
that
I
went,
wanted to bring that up.
yeah.
Good. You
Uh,
explain it.
well, there was the main effort of the kinder transport was, of course, the Jewish community. Sometimes when people talk about who was responsible for it, they tend to gloss over the role of the Jewish communities in Berlin and in Munich and Frankfurt and so on, who were doing just what, I mean, they were just trying to survive and still help each other out. So they needed the help of other people just to negotiate with the German authorities to grant exit visas. And then even to make the thing more difficult was getting visas from the receiving countries, Great Britain, Sweden, United States, and so on. So it was one hell of an issue. By the time everyone understood that things were all over. If the kids didn't get out, they would be deported, and many feared that they would be killed by the time that program was started. Why would they put a 5-year-old on a train if that wasn't the fear? Um, so I don't really know how she was selected, except that it was a surprise, and and you know the I mean, I'm in touch with other people who had parents on the Kindertransport. They they uh, they don't even know when they left half the time, even though they're now coming up with a list of transports that has names on them. Amy um, Williams, who's a researcher out of Great Britain, went to Yad Vashem and she discovered some of the transport lists in the files there. So I would say I just knew that she got on the train. She never talked much about the Kindertransport as a program, but simply as a way of her father having been able to get us selected, to get on the train to go to England. Uh,
And this was early. You told me it was
this
in December 30.
no, it was in 1939, May 5th.
Oh, oh, sorry, I can't read my own writing. May 5th. Okay.
May 5th.
So a few
And
months before the beginning of the war, when
yeah,
everything
she
closed.
had about 3 months, and her music teacher got out about 3 months afterwards. And there's an interesting story about him. His fiance was already in England, and he was trying to get a visa to go to Great Britain. And a friend of his, he got in touch with him, and his friend was a member of the SS, and he says, "You better not go home because we're coming for you." I mean, he warned him off. He said, "Don't go home." So he rode around in the subway there, or the S-Bahn, U-Bahn, for 3 days, waiting to be notified. I guess he had it organized where he would go to some point whether or not the document had arrived or not. And then after 3 days, managed to leave England. I mean, leave Germany for
England.
uh, England. And he was in a camp there for a while, almost, and then he found his way as a music educator in England.
We have to. I'm doing an interview soon about uh, the fact that German Jewish men, eh, even more so, I think, than German Jewish women coming to England, were interned. But just for people who don't know, they were interned as enemy aliens for
That's
a
right.
while. We're not going to go through this whole story here, but because the British didn't make any distinctions between the German Jews realizing they hated Hitler and the other Germans coming who might have been spies. So
That's
that's
right.
what Peter means when he says they were interned. And there's a really interesting book whose title I can't remember. It's about the man at the Isle of Man, et cetera, et cetera. But the creativity all crammed into these internment camps because of who was interned. But okay, I'm interrupting Peter's story.
That's okay.
So now let's skip ahead a little because I want to talk about, I know where I got the December from. December 1941. What happened to your grandmother? This, I think, is very important for people to know.
Well, what we know is that my mother received a Red Cross message saying that your mother has gone to Riga, no word from your mother. In other words, no, she went to a place where she couldn't write.
Right, well, wait, but this was
That's all they
after
knew.
your grandfather died, right?
That's right. She was
Okay,
a widow for about a year.
okay.
And that was it.
Okay,
And
wait,
and the amount of timing,
we
yeah,
need to explain where Riga is.
Riga is
Riga
in
is in
Latvia.
Latvia, and it's the
Yeah.
Baltics. And as I told Peter, I have a connection. I won't go into it here. Why Latvia? My mother's family's from Latvia. Most of them got out in time, but there were some people who managed to survive. And people don't talk about the Baltics a lot in Riga, but for some reason, certain German Jews were sent there. And I forget the name of the forest outside Riga where many, many, many were shut. Oh,
Rumbula.
Rambula.
I
Okay,
visited Riga and the forest. I spent a
so
few
let's
days
spell
in
it.
Riga. Yeah.
It's Rumbula. Is that right?
Yeah. Rumbula.
Yes. Okay.
Rumbula.
Yeah. Because I get it confused with Poneri outside Vilna. So this is another, I mean, it's an also famous, infamous killing forest, and the one outside Riga is also infamous. So the assumption is that she was shot there or died of starvation.
Yeah. Now, what we think, I mean, we went back to Riga and I went to the Jewish community there. I got a Russian guide uh, to take me around there, take us around. And there was also a rabbi in Riga who had a museum and still does, and a monument to as many victims that he could names he could locate. And he has a wall just like in Washington D.C. and it had my mother's name on it. So interesting. The
Wait. I just, one other thing. I asked Peter if his mother, while she remained, excuse me, his grandmother, while she remained in Berlin, had been moved from her apartment to what they called Jew homes. The Nazis started rounding up German Jews, and, forcing them out of their apartments and putting them in these crowded conditions while using them as slave labor, basically, in Berlin. And so Peter's going to tell you why his grandmother probably wasn't forced to do that because she worked for.
she worked for Rabbi Zolomonsky, uh, whom I assume was her husband knew him because he was, he was a cantor and so on, and she took care of those his two children. And
So she
of course,
lived there.
the thing is, the rabbi was deported 2 years later, along with his two children. I mean, very sad story.
Wait. Your mother was, excuse me, your grandmother was deported before the rabbi. I always envisioned
No,
with.
no, no, no. While he was still there, she was deported before he was deported. Um, because I know the dates that he was deported, and that was later. Yeah, and so she didn't live anywhere else besides her own home, and then in that particular home, and that was still pretty early on because people were still living in their own homes towards the end of 41, a lot of them, and and that's also when late 41, that's when most of the deportations began. But they were yanked from their own homes. And that's as much as I know. There's a lot you don't know because even with the Red Cross correspondence, it took so long to go back and forth. She didn't know about her father's death until a month after it happened. Um, and a lot of the correspondence before the US and Germany declared war went from Germany to the United States via her relatives, and they sent those letters to her in England. And she wrote to England to send the letters to her parents and to
Interesting.
her
Okay.
relatives.
Just to remind everyone, United States and Germany were not at war until December 1941 after the Japanese
Exactly.
bombed Pearl Harbor. And I would like to talk about Track 17 because the Berlin Jews were deported from more than one train station. But Peter knows that his grandmother was deported from this track, and this track has a memorial to this there that I think is very enlightening.
Well, I don't know that for sure. I mean, I mean,
Yeah.
just because they have a monument there doesn't mean it actually happened. That, you point out that it might have happened from different
Oh,
departure.
so you don't know that your
I have
grandmother,
I have no proof.
of
All I
which,
know is they say that her train left from there, and apparently the Germans had records of trains, and she was on the train where they had 1,000 Jews. That was the initial shipment to Riga.
and they were not in cattle cars, right? Because they were leaving
They were
Berlin.
just leaving on a normal train. She didn't go to
Right.
cattle car. Yeah,
Right.
that was still early on. The final solution, where they suddenly just it just went, was a little bit later.
Yes. Well, the Wannsee Conference was January 20th, 1942, and
That's
that's
right.
when everything got really elevated. But Berlin Jews were
Right.
being shipped out before then. I remember at the museum, the Topography of Terror, I think is the name of it in Berlin. It's done so well that you can read the whole narrative on placards outside. My daughter and I never even went inside, but I remember that at one point, one of the top Nazis, again, I can't tell you which one, was very upset that Berlin was not Judenfrei by a certain date. And in fact, it was never Judenfrei. In the 70s, I published a account of a Jewish woman who survived, young Jewish woman who survived in Berlin as they called them a U-boats, I think, openly without papers, during the day. Now, I think she had a German Jewish accent, so that probably helped. Instead of a Polish Jewish accent, they sat in cafes and at night they hid in the ruins. So the irony is that Berlin was never Judenfrei, although they tried very, very, very hard to do so.
Yeah, so there's lot of holes when you start trying to figure out what happened. I mean, my mother's story, there were some surprises even when over years in England, I managed to get some reports from the Jewish Refugee Council that because she had a social worker, she had a bipolar and she had a breakdown when her father died, but she recovered very quickly and just continued her nursing career. She was pretty resilient, but she did have bipolar, which may or may not have had anything to do with the Holocaust, but it certainly didn't do it any good. Um, but she was also able to recover just without medication in England and also in Germany when she received some care at the Jewish hospital in Berlin. So
Wait, do you
that
mean before the
hospital
war or you mean after the war?
after the war,
Yeah,
afterwards.
okay. So what we didn't tell the audience is that Peter came back with his mother and I guess I can say stepfather in
Yeah.
47, and his sister was born in 48. So that's Peter's referring to after the war.
Yeah, so I sort of became even though I was born in south of London, and my father was from Oxford, and he wanted to marry her. My mother uh, rejected his offer because he felt that his family didn't approve and that he wasn't cut out for family life. She didn't. She had a lot of pride. If you're not 100% with me, forget it. And but the German POW she met, he was all in. And that was true. He loved her, was crazy about her. And they went back and faced the music in Berlin. Now, I grew up in that environment in post-war Berlin from 1947 to 1954, and that's when we left Berlin for the United States. I spoke only German, a little bit of English. My mother taught me, and she was fluent in English because she had lived in England for almost 10 years. And she'd also used the English in the black market right after they arrived. They had to get food on the table. So she was selling cigarettes with her connections in the British and American Army, which, when you're fluent like that, uh, there's a bunch of movies that have been made about
Yes,
your
yes.
life, that I don't know how true they are, but they sort of ring a bell.
So we have a
That
few
was
minutes
it.
left. What do you think is the most important for this audience to understand about Berlin and the adjustments that refugees and I, by the way, consider her a Jewish survivor. The fact that she got out before, to me, it didn't save her from the trauma.
Oh no, because she I mean, I try to explain to people that she had they came from a very close family, devoutly Jewish. She was kind of but she was religious. She was brought up that way. And at a certain point, she lost everything, you know, everything was cut off. And she actually was engaged to a Jewish soldier who was older, and I guess he was in the British Army in intelligence, and I got some letter. I did discover some letters that they were engaged, that they were to be married at some point, and it apparently never happened. My mother never talked about it. And when people say, how could she leave with a German POW? I say to them, look, she liked England. She did well there as a nurse. She thought, there wasn't anything wrong there, but she felt she really didn't belong. And she also always felt that she should have died with her parents.
She really felt that way.
hmm She wrote about it. She put it all in writing. So people can know how she felt. I mean, that's why I wrote the book about it. I didn't really want to become a Holocaust Harry. That's not my, you know, uh, I was reluctant to, I grew up just saying that's something you don't talk about. None of my friends knew what had happened to my family.
But your family told you.
Oh, sure, my mother told me. Well, I found out when she had one bipolar episode in the States. I got the whole thing in from, it was like a floodgate. But up to that point, she kind of tried to shield my sister and me in Germany. She took us to some synagogues just so that we could become essentially reacquainted with Judaism. And she kind of told us not to point at arms if we saw numbers on forearms. Of course, my sister decided to do that anyhow, and the man just left and said that's just to help me remember my telephone number. But I mean, you got to understand what the mindset was after the war. My cousins in LA, the ones who survived, who also came right before the war, mind you, her cousins got out because they had, just enough resources to do that. They never talked about it. And in fact, I talked to my second cousin. He said he saw his father cry once a year, but because his father refused to leave because he didn't think the Germans were serious, despite the fact that his uncle was trying to get the family out. But my mother's family knew what was coming down early on. They tried to get visas. They had a cousin in Santa Monica, California, uh, who was um, on the Koroshinsky side, who his family had come to the U.S. in the 19th century, and they were willing to sponsor his parents and her, and the visas were being held up by the State Department. And in desperation, uh, her family tried to get my mother out. There was talk about going to Israel, or there was a boy she knew who was who had planned to escape through Holland, but her parents wouldn't let her go, and he was shot doing that. I mean, the situation was awful. At a certain point, getting out, this was in 39 and before, it was pretty dire. Uh, they didn't want to go to Israel, I think, because they felt it was, too rough and tumble. I mean, uh, right next to the Jewish girls' school, there was a orphanage, the Ahawa, I can't pronounce it, but an orphanage where which sent which many of the people from that orphanage went to the girls' school. So, and to me, that's also an interesting story. But a lot of those kids managed to, not all of them by any means, went to Israel. But a majority of the teachers and students at her school were deported and killed. And she writes about it. She knew while it was happening, people were just disappearing right and left in 38. They were deporting people. And so sometimes she thought one of her teachers had died, but she wound up actually managed to get to Sweden. So we don't even know the full story. I've never been able to get the full list of the teachers at the school or the students at the school. The records just aren't there. And I went to the Neue Synagogue, to the library. I talked to a Frau Welke. I remember them. I corresponded with them. I've done a lot of follow-up. I've been to Berlin a few times. And believe it or not, I have a little story to tell about my first exposure to the Jewish girls' school. My wife and I went to Berlin, obviously
Right.
to see what happened. And we went to the Neue Synagogue. And before we went in there, she said, and my wife's Catholic raised, by the way, she said, I have a feeling we're going to see a picture of your mother. She said that just as we entered, and we did. She was part of an exhibit because the exhibit was on Jewish life in the 1930s. There she was in a picture of a school play about Rabbi Akiba. Okay, so I went to the head of the woman in charge of the exhibit. She sent me the picture. I sent it to my mother's best friend from that school, who did manage to escape with her mother to Holland. I mean, to Belgium. And she said, "Is this her?" For definitely. She corroborated, "Yeah, that's her, definitely." So, and then we went. I went back another time, and the same woman who got us the picture, she said, "Well, let's take a look." And I got a key. I can go over to where the Jewish girls' school is. Let's take a look inside. And there was the set, the paper mache set of the for the school play that she appeared in. It was just absolutely insane. And it was completely dark in there. That was before the Jewish girls' school was repurposed to become what later was a set of restaurants and art galleries and the Kennedy Museum many years later. And I've got a whole list of things of the history of that school after the war. What happened to the school was in 1942, it was shut down permanently. But for all intended purposes, things stopped there by 1940, because
Right,
everyone's
right.
being deported. It became a hospital for the Nazis used it as a soldiers' hospital during the war. When after the war with the DDR, it was turned into a school again. It was named after
He's referring to East Germany, right?
East Germany. I mean, I'm almost 80. Sometimes I can't pull. Uh, who wrote
It's
Mother
okay.
Courage? The German
Yeah, it's
playwright.
okay, but he's referring
Yeah.
to
I mean, just can't think of it. But Bertolt Brecht. How could I not think of his name? But the school was named after him. And then later on, it was returned to the Jewish community, and they fiddled around for a number of years trying to figure out what to do with it. And finally, there was a plan to turn it into a sort of a cultural center. And what happened was that when we went back to visit the school in its repurposed form, there was that picture of her in the school play right in the lobby as one of the pictures exemplifying Jewish life in that school. There were only a handful of pictures. So, of course, there were no names of teachers, no names of students. You know, it's, the sort of, and you can't really say, oh, it's the Germans' fault. It's just that's the way it happened because the decision to repurpose the school was made by the Jewish community, and the architectural firm they hired specialized. They wanted to keep the building in the spirit of what the architect intended. So it was a wonderful effort even to repurpose the school. And you can maybe say, well, oh boy, what sacrilege to turn this wonderful girls' school into a museum and art gallery. And I wrote in the memoir about an art exhibit which featured a naked woman on a motorcycle with a California license plate exhibited in the German in the Jewish school. And my mother would have laughed. She would have thought it was so funny because she had a sense of irony and a sense of humor that kind of maintained her despite what she went through. And my sister and I managed to have, semi-normal lives, have families and all that. So people get through these things, but it wasn't easy.
with that thought, though, we have to end this show, but it does uh, lead right to my closing for each of these episodes, besides thanking Peter, to say, may the memories of those victims and those who tried to save them be a blessing forever.